In the heart of a city that never seemed to sleep, he was a permanent fixture of stillness. The world rushed past him in a blur of hurried footsteps and muffled conversations, a river of expensive shoes and worn-out sneakers flowing around the small, unmoving stone that was him. He sat in the same doorway every day, his back pressed against the cold brick, a tattered blanket pulled tight around his shoulders. It wasn't much of a blanket, more a collection of holes and frayed edges held together by memories and stubborn threads. To the thousands of people who passed by each day, he was invisible. They would look through him or over him or just past him, their eyes sliding away as if his poverty was something contagious. He was just part of the scenery, like the chipped paint on the window frame or the discarded gum flattened into the pavement. He was a shadow, a ghost haunting his own life. His name was Elias, though it had been a long time since anyone had called him that. To the world, he had no name. He was just the man in the doorway. His days were measured by the slow arc of the sun across the sky and the changing color of the light on the opposite building. His hand, grimy and trembling, was almost always outstretched, holding a small, dented paper cup. It was an empty gesture most of the time. The cup would rattle with the vibration of a passing bus, but the clink of a coin was a rare and surprising sound. When it did come, it was usually from someone who didn't even look at him, a flick of the wrist meant to clear a conscience, not to help a person. He would watch the coin fall, a tiny flash of silver in the dirt, and feel nothing. It wasn't enough for food, not really. It was just a reminder that he was still there, a beggar, but beneath the layers of dirt and despair, behind the vacant eyes that stared at the passing crowd, a different world existed. A world of polished wood and ivory keys, of soaring melodies and delicate harmonies. In his mind, he could still feel the smooth, cool surface of a piano key under his fingertip. He could feel the weight of the action, the satisfying resistance as he pressed down, and the beautiful, pure note that would ring out in response. His hands, now cracked and stained, were once his greatest treasure. They were hands that a famous conductor had called gifted by God. They were hands that could make a piano weep with sorrow or sing with joy. He had been a prodigy, a young man with a future so bright it was blinding. The conservatory had courted him, critics had praised him, and a life of concert halls and applause had been laid out before him. That life felt like a story he had read once, a long time ago. The memory of it was a constant, dull ache in his chest. It was a life that had been shattered in a single, horrifying moment. He could still see the faces of his wife and daughter so clearly in his mind. His wife, with her laugh that could light up the darkest room, and his little girl with her tiny hands that would dance on his knees as he played. He remembered teaching her a simple melody, her small fingers struggling to find the right notes, her face scrunched up in concentration. The memory was so vivid, so real, that he could almost feel her small head resting on his shoulder. The pain of that memory was a physical thing, a tightness in his throat that made it hard to breathe. The accident had taken them in an instant. A screech of tires, a sound of crushing metal, and then a silence so profound and absolute that it had swallowed his whole world. The grief that followed was not a gentle sadness. It was a tidal wave. A monster that had torn through his life, leaving nothing but wreckage in its wake. It had washed away his home, his career, his will to eat, to sleep, to live. And most cruelly it had washed away his music. The day after the funeral he had sat at his grand piano, the one that had been his whole world, and placed his hands on the keys. But the magic was gone, the keys felt like cold, dead stones. When he tried to play, the only sound that came out was a discordant, ugly noise that mirrored the chaos in his soul. The music, his one true voice, had died with them. He couldn't bear to look at the piano after that. It was a beautiful, sharp-edged memory of everything he had lost. He sold it for a fraction of its worth along with everything else in the apartment and just walked away. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he had to leave the ghosts behind. But the ghosts had followed him and they lived with him now in this cold, hard doorway across the cobblestone square. The city had put up a public piano. It was a bright, cheerful thing, painted with swirls of color, sheltered by a small awning to protect it from the rain. It was an invitation to anyone who wanted to play. Tourists would stumble through a clumsy version of a pop song. Students would practice their scales, and sometimes a truly talented person would sit down and draw a small crowd. Elias would watch them from his doorway, his expression unreadable. Every note that drifted across the square was a twist of the knife. A happy, simple melody was a reminder of the happiness he had lost. A complex, passionate piece was a reminder of the skill he had let die. The piano was a siren calling to the part of him that was still buried under the grief, but he could never bring himself to answer. He was terrified of what might happen if he did. Terrified that the music would still be gone, or even worse, terrified that it would still be there, a beautiful, agonizing ghost of the life he could no longer have. And so he just watched, a silent prisoner in his doorway, while the silent music screamed in his head. The city had a new rhythm, a frantic, excited pulse that seemed to beat faster than usual. For the man in the doorway, it was just another layer of noise, an annoying hum that vibrated through the cold stone and into his bones. He saw the posters first, splashes of vibrant color on the dull gray walls of the buildings opposite him. They were everywhere, taped to lampposts, glued to construction site hoardings, and tucked into the windows of cafes. At first he paid them no mind. They were just advertisements like the ones for new phones or fast food burgers, part of a world that had long since left him behind. But the image on the posters was always the same. A grand piano, its lid open, bathed in a single, dramatic spotlight and bold letters that screamed, "National Symphony Talent Search." The words meant nothing to him, but the excitement they generated was impossible to ignore. People didn't just walk past the posters. They stopped. They pointed. They talked. Snippets of conversation drifted over to him like leaves in the wind, carried by the voices of people who had futures and dreams. "Did you see who's on the judging panel?" A sharply dressed woman asked her friend as they hurried by. "Maestro Aldrich himself. They say he can hear a single wrong note from a mile away. He's destroyed careers with just a look." The man in the doorway closed his eyes, not wanting to hear. The name Aldrich was a distant echo, a ghost from a life he used to know. He had once dreamed of playing for that very conductor. Later that day, a group of college students sat on the edge of the fountain, eating their lunch and chattering excitedly. "I'm more nervous about Elena Vance," one of them said, her voice full of awe. "She's not just about technique. She listens for the soul in the music. If you don't have a story to tell, she know." Another student laughed, a short, cynical sound. "You're all scared of the wrong people. It's Simon Thorne you should be worried about. I read his review last week. He said a rising violinist played with the emotional depth of a teaspoon. He's a shark." The man in the doorway pulled his blanket tighter. Maestro Aldrich, Elena Vance, Simon Thorne. They were giants, titans of a world that was now just a fantasy to him. The competition felt like a party happening in a different country, a place he could never go. The public piano in the square saw a lot more action these days. Inspired by the posters, people who hadn't played in years would tentatively approach it, their fingers stumbling through simple tunes. It was usually a source of quiet torture for him, each clumsy note a reminder of what he had lost. But one afternoon, it was different. A little girl, no older than 5 or 6, broke away from her mother's hand and ran towards the colorful instrument. She had bright red ribbons in her pigtails and a determined look on her round face. Her mother called after her, but the girl was already scrambling onto the bench, her little legs dangling high above the ground. He watched her, his usual indifference softening into something else. She was so small, so full of life. She stared at the keys for a moment, her head cocked to one side, and then she placed a tiny finger on a white key. A single clear note rang out. She smiled, a gap-toothed, joyful smile, and then began to play. It wasn't a song, not really. It was a child's exploration, a series of notes that didn't quite fit together. But then a melody emerged, hesitant and sweet. It was "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." She fumbled a few notes, her small fingers not quite strong enough to press them down correctly, but she didn't care. She was making music, and in that moment the world around the man in the doorway dissolved. The noise of the traffic, the chatter of the crowd, the cold seeping into his bones, it all vanished. He was no longer on a dirty city street. He was in a warm, sunlit room. The smell of dust and old books was in the air, and a little girl with the same determined look in her eyes was sitting on his lap. Her hand, so small and soft, was resting on top of his larger one. "Like this, Daddy," she'd whisper as he guided her finger to press a key. "Twinkle, twinkle." She would sing, her voice slightly off-key, but the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He could feel the weight of her body against his chest, the tickle of her hair against his chin. The memory was so real, so painfully, exquisitely real, that it felt like a physical blow. The little girl in the square finished her song with a final, triumphant bang of a chord and slid off the bench, running back to her mother, who scooped her up with a laugh. But the man in the doorway didn't see her go. He was still trapped in the past, in a room that no longer existed, holding a daughter who was gone forever. A tear, hot and salty, traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. It was the first tear he had cried in years. The pain was no longer a dull, heavy ache. It was a sharp, stabbing agony that took his breath away. But something else was there, too. A feeling he hadn't felt in a long, long time. A desperate, gnawing need. That night, the city was quieter. The last of the commuters had rushed home, the restaurants were starting to close, and the square was bathed in the orange glow of the streetlights. The public piano stood alone under its awning, looking almost lonely. The man in the doorway couldn't sleep. The memory of his daughter and the simple melody she loved kept echoing in his mind. The silence of the square was no longer peaceful. It was a void, an empty space that screamed to be filled. He felt a pull, an invisible thread connecting him to that bench, to those keys. Slowly, stiffly, he got to his feet. His joints ached from a day of stillness. He walked across the cobblestones, his footsteps the only sound in the quiet square. It was the longest walk he had ever taken. Every step was a battle. A voice in his head screamed at him to stop, to turn back to the safety of his doorway. What was the point? It would just be more pain. But another voice, a quieter, more insistent voice, pushed him forward. He had to know. He had to feel it one more time. He reached the piano and stood before it, a dark, ragged shadow against its bright colors. He looked down at his hands. They were a mess. The nails were cracked and rimmed with black dirt. The skin was rough and calloused. These were not the hands of a musician. They were the hands of a beggar. He felt a wave of shame so powerful it almost made him turn away. These hands were not worthy of touching these keys, but then he remembered his daughter's small hand resting on his. He took a deep, shaky breath and sat down on the bench. It felt strange and unfamiliar. He lifted his hands, his trembling fingers hovering over the ivory keys. They were so clean, so perfect. He closed his eyes, shutting out the world, shutting out the shame and the fear. He just let his fingers fall. They didn't land on the simple, happy notes of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." Instead, they found a cluster of keys in the lower register. A single, deep chord echoed through the square. It was not a loud sound, but it seemed to swallow all the silence around it. It was a sound full of sorrow, a sound that spoke of loneliness and loss, but underneath it all there was a flicker of something else. A hint of love, a memory of beauty. It was the sound of his soul, raw and exposed. A few blocks away, a woman who ran a small coffee cart was just finishing up for the night, wiping down her counters. She heard the sound drift over the quiet buildings, a single haunting note that seemed to hang in the cold air. She stopped what she was doing and listened. It wasn't a song. It was just a sound, but it was a sound that told a story. It was a sound that made her heart ache. She peered out into the square, trying to see who was playing, but all she could see was a dark figure hunched over the piano. She didn't know who it was, but she knew she had just heard something important. The sound she had heard the previous night didn't leave her. It followed the woman who ran the coffee cart through her morning routine, a haunting melody that wasn't a melody at all, but a single, profound chord of sorrow. As she steamed milk for lattes and handed out pastries, her eyes kept drifting across the square to the huddled figure in the doorway. He was just a man she saw every day, a silent part of the city's furniture. But now she saw him differently. She had heard his voice, the one he didn't even know he had shared. The posters for the National Symphony Talent Search were plastered right next to her cart. She had looked at them 100 times, but now she saw them with new eyes. It was a crazy idea, the kind of idea that pops into your head and you immediately dismiss. But this one didn't go away. It took root. That music she heard, it was more than just a sad noise. It was real. It was more honest than anything she had ever heard on the radio. People needed to hear it. More importantly, he needed to play it that afternoon. When the lunch rush had faded, she tore one of the posters from the wall. She found the application form online and printed it out at the local library. The form asked for a name, an address, a phone number, a piece to be performed. She stared at the blank boxes. She only knew one thing for sure, his name. She had heard someone call him that once, a long time ago, before he had become completely invisible, Elias. She wrote it down in the neat, simple script she used for customer orders. For the address, she hesitated, then wrote the doorway on the north side of the square. For the phone number, she drew a line through the box. For the piece, she simply wrote, undecided. It looked ridiculous, but she folded it, put it in an envelope, and mailed it anyway. It was a message in a bottle, a desperate hope thrown into a vast ocean. A week later, she saw him huddled in his spot as a cold rain began to fall. She brewed an extra strong coffee, poured it into a cup with a lid, and carried it over to him. He didn't look up, just kept his eyes fixed on a puddle forming at the edge of the curb. She crouched down in front of him, holding out the cup. It's hot, she said softly. No charge. He slowly lifted his gaze, his eyes wary and confused. He took the cup, his fingers brushing against hers for a second. She didn't pull away. I heard you play the other night, she said, her voice gentle. It was beautiful. He flinched as if she had struck him. He looked down, his face hidden by the brim of his dirty hat. He said nothing. There's a competition, she continued, pushing on before he could retreat back into his shell. A big one. For musicians, I put your name down. She held out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a confirmation letter saying he had been accepted for a preliminary audition. He stared at the paper as if it were a snake. No, he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. I can't. Why not? She asked, her tone still kind but firm. They'll just laugh at me, he said, the words barely audible. Look at me. He gestured down at his ragged clothes, his dirt-caked hands. Let them, she said simply. This isn't about them. It's about you. It's about the music. You have a story to tell with those hands. Don't let it die in the rain. She didn't wait for an answer. She just left the paper on the ground beside him and walked back to her cart, her heart pounding. She had done what she could. The rest was up to him. He sat there for a long time, the coffee growing cold in his hands, the letter getting damp in the drizzle. The idea was insane. It was a nightmare waiting to happen. But her words echoed in his mind. Don't let it die in the rain. He thought of his daughter, of her small hand on his. He thought of the silence that had followed the accident, a silence he had filled with the noise of the street, but which had always felt empty inside. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was terrifying. It was a tiny, fragile spark of hope. The day of the audition arrived, cold and gray. He felt like a man walking to his own execution. He had no proper clothes, just the least worn of his tattered trousers and a threadbare sweater. His hands were clean, though. He had spent an hour at a public restroom, scrubbing them with harsh soap until they were raw, trying to wash away years of dirt. He still felt filthy. The audition hall was in a grand old building that looked like a palace. As he walked up the stone steps, people in smart coats and expensive shoes gave him a wide berth, their expressions a mixture of disgust and pity. He felt their eyes on him like a physical weight. He was an alien on this planet. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of floor wax and expensive perfume. The lobby was filled with other contestants, young and confident, clutching instrument cases and sheet music. They were a world away from him. When he walked in, a hush fell over the room. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. He could hear the whispers start like the rustling of dry leaves. Who is that? Is he lost? Probably some homeless guy looking for a warm place to sleep. He kept his head down, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, and made his way to the registration desk. The woman behind the desk looked at him, then at her list, then back at him, her nose wrinkled. Name? She asked, her voice cold. Elias, he mumbled. She scanned the list, her finger tracing down the page. I don't see... Wait, here it is. Elias. Address, the doorway on the north side of the square. Is this some kind of joke? Before he could answer, a security guard appeared at his side. Is there a problem here? The guard asked, his hand resting on Elias's shoulder. This man doesn't belong here. He's on the list. A voice cut through the tension. It was the woman from the coffee cart. She had followed him, a quiet guardian angel. She hurried to the desk, pulling the confirmation letter from her bag. See? He's scheduled to audition. The registration woman and the guard stared at the letter, then at Elias, their faces full of disbelief. They were clearly annoyed, but the letter was official. With a sigh of frustration, the guard stepped back. Fine, but he stays with you. And he better not cause any trouble? From their table at the front of the auditorium, the three judges watched the commotion with a shared look of irritation. Maestro Aldrich, a severe-looking man with a perfectly trimmed gray beard, tapped his pen on his notepad, his impatience palpable. He had no time for publicity stunts. Elena Vance, the celebrated pianist, looked on with a flicker of concern in her eyes, her empathy warring with her professionalism. And Simon Thorne, the critic, allowed himself a small, cynical smile. He was already composing the opening line of his review in his head. The National Symphony Talent Search, in a desperate bid for relevance, has apparently started recruiting from bus shelters. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a harried assistant called his name. Elias, you're up. The woman from the coffee cart gave him a small, encouraging nod. He walked towards the stage, his legs feeling like lead. The aisle seemed to stretch for a mile. Every eye in the room was on him. He could feel their judgment, their contempt. He climbed the 3 steps to the stage and walked into the blinding glare of the spotlights. The auditorium was a vast, dark sea of faces all watching him. He saw the 3 judges at their table, silhouetted against the light. He could feel their dismissive stares from across the room. He was a joke to them, an annoyance. He sat down at the gleaming grand piano, the king of all instruments, and felt like a fraud. The contrast was absurd. He placed his now clean but still trembling hands on the keys. The world fell away. It was just him, the piano, and the ghosts he carried with him. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and prepared to tell his story. A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the grand auditorium. It was not the respectful quiet that usually precedes a performance. It was a thick, sticky silence filled with judgment and curiosity. From the stage, the man could feel it pressing down on him. The bright, hot lights blinded him to the individual faces in the crowd, but he could feel their collective stare, 1,000 tiny needles pricking his skin. He could hear a few poorly suppressed coughs and the rustle of a program. Someone in the back let out a short, sharp laugh, quickly hushed by their neighbor. He was a spectacle, a freak show interrupting their serious afternoon of music. He sat at the gleaming grand piano, a monument of polished black wood and gleaming ivory, and felt like a smudge of dirt on a masterpiece. He placed his hands on the keys. They were clean now, but they felt foreign to him, weak and unsure. The judges at their long table watched him with open disdain. The severe-looking conductor, Maestro Aldrich, had already picked up his pen, ready to scribble a dismissive note the moment the first note was played. The famous pianist, Elena, looked at him with a kind of weary pity, as if she felt sorry for the poor, deluded soul. And the critic, Simon, had a smirk on his face, a predator who had just been served an easy meal. They were expecting a disaster. A clumsy, offensive noise that would confirm all their prejudices. They were waiting for him to fail. For a long moment he did nothing. He just sat there, his head bowed, his hands resting on the cool ivory. He wasn't thinking about the judges or the audience. He wasn't even thinking about winning or losing. He was thinking about the little girl with the red ribbons in her hair. He was thinking about the feel of her small hand on his. He took a deep, shaky breath, the air catching in his throat. And then he began to play. The first notes were not what anyone expected. They were quiet, hesitant, almost clumsy. A single, low note rumbled out, followed by another, like a person waking up in a dark room and feeling for the light. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats, a silent, "I told you so," passing between them. Maestro Aldrich's pen started to move. But then something shifted. The hesitant notes began to connect, forming a simple, questioning melody. It was a child's tune, the "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" he had heard in the square, but it was different. It was not played simply. It was filled with a tenderness, a love so pure and profound that it seemed to make the air in the room shimmer. The melody was a conversation, a gentle back and forth between two hands, one strong and sure, the other small and delicate. It was the sound of a father teaching his daughter, a memory painted in sound. The smirks in the audience began to fade. The pens on the judge's table stopped moving dots. Suddenly, without warning, the gentle melody was shattered. A storm of sound erupted from the piano. It was chaos. It was a crash of dissonant chords, a frantic, desperate race up and down the keyboard. The notes were no longer beautiful. They were violent, angry, screaming. It was the sound of screeching tires, of shattering glass, of a world being torn apart. The music was a physical assault, a raw expression of horror and pain that made everyone in the auditorium flinch. It was the accident, the moment his life had been broken into a million pieces, played out with a terrifying, brutal honesty. The woman from the coffee cart, who had managed to find a seat in the back, put her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with tears. She understood. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the storm passed. A single high, hanging note lingered in the air before fading into an absolute, deafening silence. The man's hands were still on the keys, but he did not move. The silence that followed was more painful than the noise had been. It was an empty silence, a void. It was the sound of a life with no music in it. It was the long, gray years of sitting in a doorway, feeling nothing, the world a muted blur. He began to play again, but this time the music was a slow, heavy funeral march. Each note was a struggle, a weight being lifted and dropped again. It was the sound of profound, bottomless loneliness, a melody so full of sorrow that it felt like a physical weight in the chest of everyone listening. The grand auditorium, once filled with cynical whispers, was now as still as a tomb. Every single person was held captive by the heartbreaking story unfolding before them. The judges were transformed. Maestro Aldrich, the man who was impressed by nothing, was leaning so far forward he was almost out of his chair. His face, once a mask of irritation, was now a picture of raw, unguarded astonishment. The pen lay forgotten on the table. Elena, the celebrated pianist, had tears streaming silently down her face. She was no longer a judge. She was just another person, completely undone by the emotion pouring from the piano. And Simon Thorne, the cynical critic, the shark, looked utterly lost. His smirk was gone, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. He was hearing a story that no review could ever capture, a truth that no amount of clever words could describe. The sorrowful melody began to change. A new note crept in, a tiny flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. It was fragile, hesitant, but it was there. It was the memory of the little girl's laugh, the warmth of the sun on his face, the kindness of a woman offering a cup of coffee. The music began to build, slowly at first, then with more confidence. It was not a happy tune, not yet. It was a melody of survival, of finding a single reason to go on when you have a million reasons to give up. It was the sound of a man, broken and lost, deciding to take one step and then another. The complexity was breathtaking, weaving together the threads of love, loss, and a fragile, enduring hope. His fingers, which had trembled with fear and cold, now moved with a strength and a certainty that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. From a place deep within his soul, he brought the piece to a close. The final melody did not end with a crash or a shout, but with a single, soft chord. It was a question, not an answer. A note of quiet hope hanging in the balance. He held it for a moment, letting it ring out, clear and pure, in the silent hall. Then he lifted his hands from the keys and placed them in his lap. His head was still bowed. He was empty. He had poured every last drop of his pain, his love, and his memory into the music, and there was nothing left. The performance was over. The final chord hung in the air of the grand auditorium, a single, shimmering question that seemed to absorb all the light and all the sound in the room. Then it faded into a silence so complete, so profound, that it felt heavier than noise. The man on the bench kept his head bowed, his hands resting limply in his lap. He was empty, a vessel that had poured out everything it contained. He was braced for the inevitable. He expected the silence to be broken by a cough, a rustle of papers, a polite but firm voice telling him his time was up. He was prepared to be escorted off the stage, a brief, embarrassing interruption in a day of proper music. He had said what he needed to say, and now he was ready to disappear back into the shadows. But the silence stretched on. It wasn't an awkward or impatient silence. It was a sacred silence. It was the sound of 1,000 people holding their breath at the same time. In the audience, a young woman who had been smirking when he walked on stage now had a hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning understanding. An old man, a retired music teacher, had his eyes closed, seeing not the ragged man on the stage, but the ghost of the prodigy he once was. Every single person in that vast, dark room was caught in the same invisible net, held captive by a story that had been told without a single word. They had not just heard a performance. They had lived a lifetime of love, loss, and fragile hope in the space of a few short minutes. At the judge's table, the three figures were as still as statues. Maestro Aldrich, the conductor whose reputation was built on an unyielding standard of perfection, had a look on his face that no one had ever seen before. It was not just surprise. It was awe. His pen, which had been poised to dismiss, lay on the table, forgotten. He was staring at the man on the stage as if he were seeing a ghost, or perhaps a miracle. Elena, the pianist, was no longer just crying. Silent tears were streaming down her face, tracing paths through her carefully applied makeup. She was not judging the music. She was feeling it, every note resonating with a part of her own soul. And Simon Thorne, the critic whose words could cut like glass, looked utterly defeated. Not by a bad performance, but by one so true, so raw, that it rendered all his clever critiques meaningless. He was staring at his own empty hands, as if realizing for the first time that they had never created anything half as real. Then, from the very back of the auditorium, a single sound broke the spell. It was the clap of one pair of hands. It was a tentative, almost hesitant sound, but in the profound silence it echoed like a gunshot. A few heads turned. Then another person joined in, and another. The sound began to grow, not into a roar, but into a rolling wave of applause that started at the back and swept forward, washing over the rows of seats. It was not the polite, obligatory clapping that follows most performances. It was different. It was deeper, more heartfelt. It was an applause of gratitude, of recognition, of shared humanity. Slowly, hesitantly, the man on the stage lifted his head. He blinked against the bright lights, his eyes trying to focus on the dark sea of faces before him. He saw them. All of them. On their feet. The entire auditorium was a forest of standing figures, their hands moving together in a thundering rhythm that shook the very foundations of the building. The sound was overwhelming, a physical force that crashed over him. He saw their faces, not with judgment or pity, but with expressions of profound emotion. He saw tears and smiles and looks of pure, unadulterated wonder. He didn't understand. It was like watching a scene from someone else's life. This couldn't be for him. His eyes searched the front of the room, drawn to the three figures who held the power to make or break a career. He saw Maestro Aldrich slowly, deliberately push his chair back from the table. The conductor stood up, his tall, imposing frame straight and proud. He did not clap wildly. He just stood there, his posture a statement of absolute respect, and brought his hands together in a firm, steady rhythm. It was an ovation from a king. Next to him, Elena was already on her feet, her face shining with tears as she applauded with all her heart. And then the man watched as Simon Thorne, the cynic, the destroyer of dreams, slowly rose to his feet. A look of sheer, unadulterated wonder was on his face. He looked down at his empty hands, then at the man on the stage, and began to clap, a slow, deliberate beat of surrender to the power of true art. The sight of the three judges, the titans of his old world, standing for him, was the thing that finally broke through his shock. The thunderous applause of the crowd was one thing, but this was something else entirely. This was validation. This was recognition. The wall he had built around his heart for so many years, the wall of grief and shame and despair, began to crumble. The emotion he had poured into the piano came rushing back at him from the audience, but it was no longer just his pain. It had been transformed. It had been understood. A sob escaped his lips, a raw, ragged sound that was swallowed by the roar of the crowd. He bowed his head again, not in shame, but in a gesture of overwhelming gratitude. He had nothing left to give them, no encore, no witty speech. He only had the truth of what he had already shared. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity. He didn't move. He just let the sound wash over him, cleansing him, healing parts of him he thought had been dead forever. He slowly lifted his hands from his lap and looked at them. In the harsh glare of the stage lights, he saw them clearly. They were still the hands of a man who had lived on the streets. They were scarred and calloused, the nails still misshapen. But as he looked at them, he saw something else. He saw the hands that had coaxed a lullaby from the keys. He saw the hands that had screamed in rage and sorrow. He saw the hands that had whispered a fragile melody of hope. These were not just a beggar's hands. They were his hands. They were the hands of a musician out in the crowd. The woman from the coffee cart was standing and clapping, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling the widest smile she had ever smiled. She caught his eye for a brief second and gave him a small, proud nod. He saw her, and in that moment he felt a connection to the world again. He was no longer a ghost. He was no longer invisible. He was a man who had a story, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt like that story might not be over. The applause began to soften slightly, and the man took a deep, shaky breath, the air filling lungs that felt lighter than they had in years. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, he knew that whatever it was, he would face it with the music still inside him,